What is up? I am Miguel Antonio, and this is the Live and Create podcast. It's where I interview artists and entrepreneurs about what it means to live a great life and create great things. On today's episode, we have Andrew Bailie. He's a singer, songwriter, and guitarist, and he shares his story and his journey of becoming confident in his own skin as an artist and what that looked like for him and the great people that he got to play alongside who helped mentor and grow him up. He also shares his story of the things he witnessed and the things his friends witnessed during the summer of 2020 during BLM protests in Omaha, Nebraska, and those experiences and the injustices that he witnessed and he saw ultimately led to him writing and recording a song called Fuck The OPD. From there, we jump off into conversations of systemic racism and really seeing how our lives everywhere is impacted by racism and the history of this country and discussing what are the things that we could potentially do to dismantle those things ourselves. It's a great conversation, has some great insight, and you're going to love it.
The Live and Create podcast.
Man, I've been digging into the podcast and I've really been enjoying it. That's one thing, Thanks, like man. A dirty little secret from my life is that I don't consume a ton of music. But
I feel you actually.
I've listened to so many podcasts. Oh my God.
It's weird because I almost have to force myself sometimes to listen to music because most of my days are spent somehow learning something new, or it's like when music becomes your job, sometimes when I want to veg out, I just want to put on like a hour or 2 hour long podcast and just hear different stories. So I actually feel you on that, but thank you, man, for listening. Were there any episodes that jumped out to you where you really connected with it?
Oh man. And I can't remember the name, but, the gentleman you had on who was talking about doing what was he doing marathons and also has an insurance business and also does music, and I can't remember, but his story was super relevant, and I just found really inspiring being in small town Kansas and having the the Black Lives Matter on his windows and just like getting scoffed
that's
at
TJ.
by people.
Okay,
TJ, yeah, that's right, yeah. I really enjoyed that one especially.
That's cool to hear because that ended up being one of the longest podcasts of the series, and I remember getting to the end and we were both like, "Oh, damn, that much time has gone by," but it's so good. But yeah, his story was really, really inspiring. I'm glad you connected with that, and he's still fighting the good fight and treading on. Like you said, the Midwest like vibe, because it's like we just moved out of the city into more rural community, and it's just a weird place,
Yeah.
and a weird place to walk like this line of challenging people and then figuring out how do I, like, there's times where we're like, shit, by saying this, are we becoming targets too? And sometimes that feels weird and scary.
I don't know what that's like at all. I have no idea.
Right. I bet.
I just released a single in January called Fuck The OPD. So
yeah. Fuck The OPD. You're living in the Midwest and here you are trying to challenge like the system in a really, I imagine, very conservative world. I've only been through Omaha I think we played, do you know a place, maybe I'm thinking of Lincoln, Fremont, Nebraska?
Yeah. Fremont is a town, kind of, I want to say northwest of Omaha, maybe by about 40 miles. So yeah, there's some good people from Fremont. Right. I know of a good venue there that actually just closed during the pandemic, which sucks. But
that's probably where we played. Tammy was the owner there.
Yeah, the Corner Bar. Yeah. Tammy's who I'm thinking of. Yeah, she's great.
She ended up being a great pickup gig on different tours, especially like East Coast. We come back in and hit that like one of our last stops and come back home. It's like, oh, we got a little extra money at the end of the time, and everyone was super cool there. But yeah, let's go and start there though. So fuck the OPD. You released this now. It's probably been what, 2 months?
Yeah, we released it on January 21st, and we did that because I just felt like 121 felt good. And I hadn't released anything since 2019. So kind of a little background about me. I had bands coming up in Omaha. I had a band called the Jazz Holes back in the day, that I guess I could say I was a band leader of, but it was really definitely more of a collaborative thing. And so all of those guys are like my musical brothers. The keyboardist who's getting some notoriety right now, Nick Simrad, it was also a part of that.
Nice.
And so there were a bunch of us from that group that ended up in New York within 2 years of each other. And now we're kind of all spread out. A couple of us are back here. The drummer just moved back, Matt Arbeiter. And so that's really, really a cool thing for the Omaha scene. But so I was a sideman when I was in New York for the most part. I led some gigs as well, and I did my own thing, but I really wasn't focused on my artistry. I moved there because in 2012, because I wanted to exist amongst, kind of what was going on there. And that was a relatively naive point of view, but that I recognize. But I think it's also on one hand kind of hard to look backwards on your life and not feel like you were naive at kind of every decision. And I hope to feel that way in 5 or 10 years about what I'm doing now.
Because we keep growing and expanding our knowledge and our own understanding of the world and ourselves. Yeah, I feel you, man.
Yeah, that's what it really should be. So I moved there and kind of lived hand to mouth for a while, and actually through knowing my musical brothers from the jazz holes, Nick Simrad especially, I ended up getting some opportunities and getting different gigs, and then just kind of fell into this kind of like church scene. And that's kind of weird because I'm not religious at all. But
so non-religious dude playing in the church world.
Yeah,
I imagine an interesting endeavor.
It's actually super common, especially for guitar players, because it's a business. Let's not kid ourselves. That's a business like anything else. They need, quality talent. And if they, there were some places that felt like, I could lend a hand. So I started playing at this church in East New York, Brooklyn, the third stop from the end on the L train. And I did that for a couple years. And then I fell in with a guy named Jay White, who is an incredible bassist and singer who's now based out of Nashville, but he was in Brooklyn. And through that, I met Corey Henry, who is a great keyboard player, organist, who from Snarky Puppy at the time. Then he split off and did his own thing that he called Corey Henry and the Funk Apostles. And I was just kind of in the right place at the right time to be the worst musician in the room. Which was incredible, which was great.
And frankly, though, like to be in a room with cats like that, and you're the worst musician, you're still doing way better than a lot of other people at that point.
I'm not. That is not a way to denigrate myself. I'm not being self-deprecating at all when I say that. I'm legitimately proud of the fact that I was able to, at least to some extent, check my ego. Try to learn the lessons that I really needed to learn, and be able to do that, and that's where a lot of my touring experience came from, and just that crew of people, knowing those musicians in New York, they kind of help each other out. I got the experience to work with Lauryn Hill once, which was really cool. She walked in the room and was like, had her guitar, and she was like, "Here, tune this," and I was like, "Yes, Miss Hill."
Yes, I will.
No, but it was a really amazing experience. And then once I realized that I wanted to do my own artistry, I moved to rural Maine, where my parents live, and commuted between there and New York to produce my first record that I released under my own name, entitled Wasteland. And I released that in 2019, and did a little touring from that, and just kind of fell into the I moved back to Omaha in 2018 because my mentor, from Maine at that point. I spent a little time in Maine, but you can't live with your parents forever. So
that's awesome.
So it's kind of like it is a little weird, having moved myself across the country 3 times in the last 10 years, but
especially I imagine a transition from being in such a cultural and artistic hub as New York or New York City, and then back to Omaha, which actually my understanding is there is a really cool scene there, at least from what I've had people share in the past, but it's hard to compete with what New York City is.
Well, there's a great scene here. And part of the decision to move back really had to do with, first off, I knew I wasn't going to be in New York forever. I love New York. I felt like a New Yorker when I was there. I was there for about 5 years. But at the same time, I am a Midwesterner at heart. I was born in Cleveland and kind of a transplant. So I grew up there until I was about 12. And then my family moved out to Omaha. And, it was one of those things where I didn't know I was going to come back to Omaha, but I spoke with my mentor. His name is Dana Murray, and he's an amazing jazz musician. And to call him a jazz musician does him a disservice because he's way more than that. But he's a drummer. I studied with him for years, and he was like the guy that was in my ear, like, "Yo, get your ass to New York, motherfucker." And it was exactly what I needed to hear at the time. But in talking to him, he had just built a studio where we in part produced Fuck The OPD. We recorded at Make Believe, and then we also did some work at Dana's studio, DM Groove Studios. And so, just talking to him, and I am an educator as well, so that played a big part in me coming back here. I like the idea of kind of just like posting up and being available to the younger cats, the up and coming musicians who want to draw from, my limited experience, and I recognize there's a perspective that you get whether you grow up in Omaha or whether you grow up in even Kansas City. Now, that is not to say there's not incredible music in Kansas City. We all know this. There's, amazing musicians. I think the person that connected us, Eddie Moore,
Oh God. Yeah. He's
incredible.
So
Yeah. And I
remember the first time sitting on stage with him. I don't know how I was sitting there playing guitar next to him because guitar is not my strong suit. I'm more of a vocalist and songwriter, and a bass player didn't show up for the gig. It's funny you said playing at a church. I had a gig where I was getting paid to play at this church. And the bass player didn't show up. He's like, "Oh, I'll cover both things." And he just sit there for like 2 seconds. And next thing you know, I'm like, "Oh, we didn't need a bass player. We're fine. This dude is killer."
Yeah. But yeah, Eddie's amazing. I've met some really incredible cats from down there. Dominique Sanders comes to mind. He's doing some great things. He's a bassist. He was working with Robert Glasper and Terrace Martin recently, and I think he might be in LA now. But anyway, what I'm trying to say, in my, as I digress,
I digress to other places too. I don't even know if I use that word correctly. So, but anyways,
no, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I just digressed inherently, so I'll misuse words too. It really behooves any serious musician to go to a place where that is a cultural hub. And the unique thing about New York, even still today, and obviously it's changed because of the pandemic, so I can't really speak on that. But when I went, you would hear about the bad old days in the 90s and before and all of that. And I don't know what that was. I can't speak to that experience. But my experience was on any given night, you could go to one of these clubs, and it didn't even have to be in Manhattan. There were so many places in Brooklyn and different parts of the city. And you could literally see world-class musicians on a Monday. Monday was a great night for music because that was the night that all the musicians who were doing like the wedding gigs and like the other artist gigs that they had, all the other sidemen like me, they would actually get to go out and do their own gig a lot of times on Monday.
Right.
And there was a great regular gig that I would go and watch at Rockwood Music Hall with Jim Campolongo. And he's just this guitarist. And the way I categorize Jim, he's a Nashville cat. And he played some with Norah Jones and some really, I think Bonnie Raitt and different names here, not to drop all those names for him, but
it gives great context though to understand where these folks are coming from.
He's he's a cat, and he had this style that was like, it wasn't jazz, it wasn't rock, it wasn't country. It was literally all three of those things, but it wasn't fusion, and he would combine elements, and I'm making it sound like fusion, but it's really not. He would sometimes combine.
You, I swear.
Yeah, right, exactly. He would sometimes combine a lot of those elements within the same song, but they would live on their own. It wasn't like he was trying to fuse them. It was like, that was just who he was and what came out. And Josh Dion is an amazing drummer that actually played on my record Wasteland.
Nice.
I was very fortunate to have him, and then Chris Morrissey on bass. And it was a trio, and it was every Monday night at 10 o'clock, Rockwood Stage 2. And it was just like this religious experience. And you could tell it was the music they really wanted to play.
Right.
So you would just have cats like that, and that's just like living and existing among that stuff just really raised my game up, because and you don't even realize it. It's almost like osmosis, because you're so focused on like somebody, especially when you first get to New York or somewhere like that. You might meet some people and you get a call, hey, here's the 40 songs we might do for this gig. There's no rehearsal, by the way. And like the last
And you won't get a call back if you fuck it up, Well,
that's the thing. Like the cats they would call last, and I'm not saying they're bad musicians. They're everybody's really good. And that's the point I'm trying to make, is that, you knew the cats that they would call that would be their last choice on that gig would show up, and like they would know every bridge. They would know the specific parts all the way through every song. And so there was this like huge learning curve, and you don't realize what existing among that type of thing does for you. So that was just, great experiences, incredible learning experience. And that's kind of touring with Corey Henry and the Funk Apostles, was also just this kind of next level experience that I was able to learn from all of those guys. And part of that was really learning to be myself, because it's like, hey, you got called on this gig because you're you. You sound like
Nice.
you. You don't sound like a Berkeley cat. You don't sound like Isaiah Sharkey or whoever, and then I would also sometimes see Corey and some of these other guys just like playing with some of these great musicians, some great guitarists that were just like way better than me. I could never play like that. I could never sound like that, but it's cool because I've got my thing,
What was it was there anything in particular that helped you settle into that confidence to say like, this is me and this is how I'm going to present my art
I think it starts with
any
rhythm.
context.
Everything is rhythm. And I did study with a drummer. So that helped. And the first thing I remember Corey really saying to me, and it was in a rehearsal with Jay White, ironically enough, in a church. And there was no drummer. The gig was Jay White on bass and vocals, Nick Simrad on keys, and talk about a monster musician, good enough to be in Corey's band playing the same instrument as him. So that's like crazy. And Corey Henry on organ. And I remember Corey getting up and kind of dancing around the room a little bit, coming back, and just like after the first song being like, oh man, we're all drummers. Because they are drummers. Corey's a drummer, Jay White's a drummer. Nick and I looked at each other and we're like, no, we're not. He's like, oh man, it feels like we're all drummers. So that was like the first thing that really was primary in that situation, and in all situations. Rhythm is just everything. And if you don't have your rhythm together, like way better than you think you need to, that is the first thing to work on. So learning to be myself was the next big step, and learning to know that was enough. That really propelled me to a place where I was much more comfortable in my own skin, and much more comfortable being my own artist. So getting back to Fuck The OPD.
It all comes full circle. All these things. Before we hit there, so it's interesting, hearing you do the church stuff. Because so like for me, I actually used to be a full-time arts director at like a multi-site church. Left that world eventually, like completely. Like I'm an atheist now. Like all sorts of weird things.
Sure.
But then it's funny. I met Eddie because a friend of mine who's still in that world started hiring me, and like I'm suddenly back in that world. I'm like, this is so weird now as someone who thinks completely differently now, but it was a paid gig. So I was like, shit, I'm going to be here and let's do this thing.
We all got to eat, man. We all got to eat.
And I learned about this whole world that, like what you were kind of sharing, where all these professional musicians they're like, Sunday morning gig? Yeah, you're gonna pay me? Let's do this.
Sunday morning, Wednesday night.
Ooh, there you go. Mixing
Yeah.
up maybe a Sunday night every once in a while. But anyway, so full circle, you have taken this incredible journey throughout your life, settling into who you are. You see a lot of the world, meet a lot of different people. You come back home
A sliver.
to Omaha,
Yeah.
a sliver, right? You come back home to Omaha, and you now Fuck the OPD comes out, but there's the stories that lead up to it. And so I'm
Well,
curious
and that's
what that looks like.
That's kind of what I'm getting at here is learning to be myself. Help me understand that I can't censor my artistry, if you will, because of being afraid of what people might think. So we all know that in most of the major cities in the country, there were protests after George Floyd was murdered. And obviously we know, I would hope everybody knows that's listening to your podcast, that there is an insane list of people, mostly people of color, who were killed at the hands of the police in one way or another. And we also know that there's no accountability around that. So May 29th, there was a protest in Omaha at the busiest intersection in Omaha, 72nd and Dodge. My partner, Katie, who is an incredible person, said she was going, and I had this like feeling in the pit of my stomach, and it was just like, this is, I agree with the message, but this protest isn't for me. So I sat that one out. I stayed home on May 29th, and I wasn't ready for what it was actually going to be, and I saw some live streams. My friend, Morgan Freeman, not the famous Morgan Freeman,
but
Morgan with two N's at the end. And I'm going to shout her out because she's an incredible person. She's an incredible friend. And she is very active in the community. So I was watching her live stream, and I saw what went down. I saw tear gas. I saw police, beating people. I saw a lot of brutality, and I was like, oh shit, my partner is there. Like, I felt like the biggest piece of shit for not going. And she got back, and she smelled real spicy with that tear gas. And she said, there's another one tomorrow. So she's going. I have to go now. So I went, and I saw with my own eyes what really happens. So I saw 1,000 people standing in a parking lot in front of a Target on 72nd and Dodge, holding signs. Some of them were shouting at the police. People weren't really happy with what had happened the night before.
right.
And I saw a bunch of stormtroopers with no badge numbers, no accountability, being bussed in by the public buses. And I saw a line of tear gas behind the crowd. So I'll paint the scene a little bit. There's obviously four sides to the intersection. So most of the people were in front of the Target on 72nd and Dodge. I was across the street. There were some other people across the street. And so my point of view was, I wasn't in that, but I was watching. And I saw with my own eyes for the first time what really happens. And you can watch videos, you can see it online. But there is something that happens when, in full disclosure, I don't like using this term because I know the history of how whiteness is it's a made up thing. Nobody's really white, but in our society, we have white people. So I happen to come from a long line of Ashkenazi Jews, and a lot of my family was killed in the Holocaust. My grandmother escaped from Poland in 1935 at the age of 8. And we were very lucky that her father was from London and had a British passport and was able to bring her over. They were also the right color to get the loan, the mortgage for their house in 1952. So that's a generation later. So I think that's an indictment of white supremacy more than it is anything else. So anyway, from my perspective, seeing this with my own eyes really changed things for me. And not that, again, it's not like I was callous before this, but it does something to you.
Mm-hmm.
So this happens. People are beaten, bloodied, and then they decide to go downtown and protest in front of the police headquarters. Well, there was a bar owner that I knew by the name. You know what? I'm not going to say his fucking name because fuck that guy. But he owned a bar in Omaha that no longer exists, and it was downtown. And he went down with 4 of his friends, and they staked out the place. They were told not to be there. He was pretty much, they were just had guns drawn. They had somebody, all of this came out later. They had somebody on the street that was scoping it out for them, talking about line of sight. He was an ex-Marine too. I know that Marines don't like to be called ex-Marines, but
Right.
they can eat a dick. He's an ex-Marine. He was no longer active duty. So his windows got broken by nobody knows who did it, and we all know that there was also an element of anarchist culture, mostly white kids, but people from all walks of life probably that were on both sides of the political spectrum that were using this as an opportunity to just create chaos. So we don't
The people
know
who want to burn it down,
exactly.
they just want to burn the whole fucking world down. They attach themselves
And
to
people,
movements like this.
because of that, people equate that with BLM or whatever, and it's like it's not accurate. But the windows got broken. Him and his dad go on the street. They start saying terrible things, throwing around racial slurs, and this gentleman, James Scurlock, was with a small group of friends, and they were just kind of in the wrong place at the wrong time, and there was an altercation. I mean, when you say the N-word to somebody, you expect to start a fight, right?
Right.
And so that's what's happening. There's like lots of witnesses. The bar owner had a gun. He fired off what the police called warning shots, which I guess you can do when you're white. They call them warning shots, and not.
Wow.
He was an active shooter. So
Yeah.
James Scurlock jumped on his back and tried to disarm him and was killed. He shot him through the neck. And hearing about this, knowing the person that did it, having played at his club before I went to New York, a regular gig, having partied with him, learning about his background and his father's background in white supremacy. His dad was radicalized in prison in the 70s through the
crazy.
Aryan Brotherhood, I believe. Finding out later that this gentleman was a Proud Boy and a member of Identity Europa. It just made me sick. Made me sick
Right.
to my stomach. Knowing what he did and knowing how easily that situation could have been avoided. And then
That's what this whole season, the last 4 years has been such an eye opener to see people that I know, even people in my own family. Like I have family that is darker skinned Puerto Ricans who want to join the Proud Boys. And it's like, it's been such a, like pulling the curtain back and seeing who the fuck people really are. It's been disheartening in some levels. Then some people surprise me in a good way. But that whole thing of like, man, like, it's almost like there's a line was drawn and people started choosing, and we started finding out real quick who people really are.
yeah, it's very true. It's very true. And so you have a police department that didn't initially arrest the perpetrator. You have a county prosecutor who refused to do his job, called it self-defense. Of course, they edited a video. There was a cell phone video, but there were plenty of witnesses that weren't canvassed that had to really seek out,
Right.
the OPD to tell their story of what they saw. They didn't want to hear it. Anybody that had anything that deviated from the official line, they didn't want to hear about it. It took, I think, 100,000 signatures, something like that, on a petition to convene a grand jury.
That's crazy.
Yeah, and they eventually convened a grand jury. So James Scurlock was killed on May 30th of 2020. There were protests continuing. And then on July 25th, I believe, what was that? I had the date in my head, and I think it was July 25th. I could be wrong on the exact date. There was a protest in a march, and they marched from an area called Midtown Crossing to downtown and back. And when they were 2 blocks from their cars over a bridge above the interstate, the police kettled them, and they did the thing where they blocked them off and said, disperse, but there was nowhere to go. So they rounded up 126 people that I knew, people that were friends of mine. I was planning on being there. I had a gig that night, so I ended up hearing about this on the way back from the gig. It didn't seem like anything that was going to be, any dramatically different than anything else that had gone on.
Right.
But it was a mass arrest incident. And the police were trying to make a point. Mm-hmm. They pepperballed everybody. After zip tying them. They beat people up. They put them on the hottest day of the year. They put them in buses, drove them down, refused to process them, kept them in a parking garage under the facility, under the corrections facility. No water, they when somebody was having muscle spasms with the zip ties, mm-hmm. Instead of loosening them or putting them in a different position, one of the officers just tightened it as much as it would go. And this is a person that was throwing up because of the muscle spasms that she was having. And it was a torture situation. And they did things like lost paperwork. They refused NLC, Nebraska Left Coalition, who would come in and pay people's bail. They refused that. They were only letting people out if their families came in and paid them because they knew that they were wealthier. And they kept people in cells without PPE. In cells designed for like 14 people, 50, 60 deep. Wow. And it was a statement. Omaha Police Department tortured people, and it doesn't matter that they do it every day. It was kind of eye-opening. They do it every day. It doesn't matter that it's normal, but hearing about that and hearing the story of really one of my really good friends, who I've known for a long time, who was also arrested, and hearing the stories from the other folks, many of which I knew. Fuck the OPD kind of came out of me, and I wasn't planning on writing something like that. I didn't do it to be divisive. I did it because these assholes fucking tortured my friends, and maybe if I was from a different community, if my skin was a different color, I wouldn't be so shocked by that. But coming from my perspective, it was very shocking. And
well, that you hit
close
upon
to
that.
home.
Like I'm Puerto Rican, but I look like a white dude and live my life like a white dude. I probably said this on the podcast often when we talked about these social justice issues, because for me, I just didn't think those things happened or existed. I didn't know that was even a world that existed, right? To repeat myself a million times. But it's hearing the stories of my friends of different minority groups and the things that they have experienced. It's just blowing my mind, where, like you said, where they're like, oh yeah, that happens all the time. Oh yeah, I deal with that all the time. I've dealt like that since I was 14. And for you to put this out there and to tell these stories, and I think helps again pull back the curtain for people who may not be in that paradigm.
Well, and that was, it was kind of, my reconciliation with the with the guilt that I felt over not being there, with the guilt that I felt over not being there on May 29th, I wasn't at every protest, after, so in August, my partner became pregnant. And so we're expecting our first child on April 29th.
Nice. Congrats,
I'm not
man.
sure when this is. Thank you. I'm not sure when this is dropping, but
it's about 3.5 weeks out on
it's
there.
very
so
possible I will be
close.
a father. I'll be a father when this drops.
Dude, that's awesome.
So we're trying to be very careful with the pandemic, obviously
Right.
raging, and people that are pregnant, women that are pregnant are, their immune systems are more compromised, and for 6 months after, and the baby has to develop an immune system. And all this to say, I wasn't at every protest, but we need storytellers too. We need lawyers. We need representation. And there are a lot of different people who aren't necessarily on the front lines of a protest who are doing things to try to advance the cause of, I come back to human rights. It's human rights.
Right.
It's basic human rights for everybody. And that was the thing. After this happened, I just kept hearing the words, do not be confused when they tell the truth. They don't give a fuck about your life. And it just kind of started there. And I believe strongly in this idea of the antenna of creation. And that is the idea. Obviously, legally, I own my music. I copyright it. I'm a member of ASCAP. We all have these worldly things that we have to navigate. And that's kind of, I think, being in my 30s now, that's part of life.
Right.
You realize that, you fight against it for as long as you can. Or if you're smart, you don't. But but then in a more real sense, in a more personal sense, nobody really writes anything. Nobody sits down and says, I am going to write this thing. It just happens, and it comes from a different place. And I feel strongly that, and this isn't an original idea by any stretch of the imagination. I go back to this Tom Waits idea, and I'm sure it's not his original idea either. But
back to the antenna of creativity, right?
Yeah. Songs are. It's like songs are already created. It's our job to channel that or to birth that. And I think about Tom Waits in the studio, like all the kids are in the van, right? Are you coming? All right. Well,
that's Stephen Pressfield, The War of Art. If you're familiar with that book, he talks about it as the muse. And I'm actually just started rereading it again. I've probably reread it, I don't know how many times throughout my history and career, but he talks about the muse, and he sees it as like a very real thing, like almost like a metaphysical thing that he shows up for in every writing session to tap into, and even though I don't necessarily go that far to believe it's like this real entity, it was such a helpful thing to understand, because when you write, sometimes it's like, where did this come from? Where did this thought, where did this idea come from? And the idea of showing up and presenting yourself to the muse or to this creative force that now you said it's like, now it's just your job to birth it. I think is a cool concept, a beautiful concept.
You can build your antenna, that's for real, like it is something that has to be worked on. There are things you can do to help that process that do involve yourself, but the actual act of channeling whatever that is, that's not necessarily up to you at a certain point. You have to kind of let go of that. And that's what I come back to, being true to my artistry. When something presents itself, I can't deny that. That doesn't mean I have to release everything, but it also means that if I wrote this song in a certain way and I'm happy with it and I like it and it speaks the message that I want it to speak, I will have to release it that way, Yeah. And just getting back to a point, I want to let you know, Miguel, I have podcasts, so I don't need to read anymore, right?
Right.
That's how it works, right?
Like I get little snippets of all random shit all the time through podcasts. That's all I need anymore. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
But so for you, this again, this concept of being comfortable in your skin as an artist. And it sounds like even the journey of being comfortable in your skin as a human, and it all like collides with the social movement that's beginning to happen that you witness and experience, and now you're able to put out this song, "Fuck the OPD," it sounds like with confidence and with the idea of to speak truth to power in a way. What for you were there? Because and I've gotten this conversation with it was actually one that just released like 2 days ago. A guy named Nuv, and he speaks a ton about social justice. He's a spoken word artist, and we talked about that journey of deciding. Are you going to speak out on these things, or are you, as artists, are you just going to not speak out about them and just manage your career? Because sometimes it can, in some instances, could tank your career. Did you wrestle with any of those things, or for you was it just again
No.
another step in that confidence?
You know, I have a stable career. Even in the pandemic, actually, what the pandemic showed me was that I don't need to take all these restaurant gigs. I don't need to do any gigs that I don't really want to do. And I do pride myself on being able to, you know, pre-pandemic, I was playing 3 and 4 hour gigs solo. Sometimes during the busy season, sometimes, you know, 5, 6, 7 nights a week, you know, and that kind of thing, I really pride myself on being able to do a few of those and not repeat anything, you know, which we're talking, you know, 8, 9 hours worth of music, you know, and obviously, you know, a couple hours of originals. And then I don't play top 40 charts. It's not that I won't play a top 40 tune. I'll play a number one hit if I feel like it, but everything kind of comes back to, I just play songs that I like. And I really like that idea of, especially in Omaha, Nebraska, where I might be in the corner at some steakhouse or some shit. And I've had this happen before where people were like, you know, maybe not in a direct line of sight with me, and just like they would ask their server, what record are you guys playing? What CD is on, or what playlist is this? And they'd be like, oh no, that's Andrew. You know,
That's awesome.
So I
You're
love
like,
that.
Thank you.
I love that that element of surprise of just being like, oh, we're just going to go get this meal in Omaha, because everybody's about restaurant culture here. You know, the general public. It's like I think we might have more restaurants per capita in Omaha than anywhere else on the planet. I'm not 100% sure about that, but it's up there. So, you know, just these people coming out, and they, you know, they might listen to them and throw somebody under the bus. They might listen to their like Jimmy Buffett record or something, just like, I'm talking rich people tastes or whatever.
Right.
not to hate on any artist, or not to hate on any sect of society, but just people that might not know any better. You know, might not consider themselves,
They haven't been exposed to more things.
Music aficionados.
Right.
And then they didn't know they were going to hear world-class music that night, but they did. And it might make them rethink, you know, what is my town? You know, I didn't think we were in a cultural hub here, but I've seen over the years somebody like Dana Murray, who helped school me up and helped school a lot of my peers up. And it was really interesting leaving for about 6 years and coming back, seeing all of these kids that were 12, 13, 14, 15 years old, who were either studying with him in one way or another. He directed drum lines at a couple of the high schools around here. And he also had a winter drum line called Dojo. And it was a situation where I came back and I'm like, oh shit, all of these kids that grew up and now they're in their late teens, early 20s, and they've got all this information that like I got
working.
that
They've been
made me
hustling.
go to New York. and
Right.
and it's a microcosm, but it's possible for one person or a small group of people to raise the bar. And it's not only Dana. There are a lot of avenues like that. There's a lot more going on with the art scene in Omaha, and not just music. There's an incredible visual arts community We've got artists like Waddy White and Bart Vargas and Barber Flashback, who actually just recently moved to Chicago. But we have this really strong community. There's the Union for Contemporary Arts in North Omaha, which brings in artists like a Barber Flashback. And I recognize that maybe a lot of people listening to your podcast that know it through you probably don't know who these people are because they're in Omaha. You're in Kansas City, or we're in you're in Kansas City, right? Or
yep,
are you
Kansas City's home.
Okay, cool. So, but I'm sure, Kansas City works like that. I'm sure there are parallel stories that they can relate to of just like some amazing musicians that went and got something from somewhere else, or even kind of came up organically and then helped to raise the bar of the scene. And, that can happen. And that's no small deal, and I think, it's possible for that to happen. So these people that might come out and see me, in some sort of restaurant situation, that don't know what they're going to get, they're like, oh my goodness, what do we have here in Omaha? Are we selling ourselves short? Are we
nice?
We're not really going out. We're not really experiencing this. Maybe I should check more into the art scene. And you know what? Maybe some of those people are on the fence and then they hear Fuck the OPD. And I purposely crafted Fuck the OPD as like a sexy groove, right? And I love that Motown, funk, soul. I'm hugely influenced by a number of great artists, but one of the intersections that I'm really influenced by are artists like Bill Withers, Al Green, those type of people, Tina Turner. So in crafting a groove like that, and then going with the title like as obscene as I can go,
right?
That's not an accident.
Maybe get someone nodding their head and they're like feeling the groove and they're like, oh, wait a minute, this is an idea I may not have been ready for. What's going on? Maybe open some eyes.
Sometimes it'll take a few listenings, especially if it's in a live situation, and they don't have to click on something that says "Fuck the OPD." They might
a little more open to it at that moment.
Yeah, I guess my whole point with that statement was, I know I have some people that listen to me that fall on the other side of the aisle. And anytime we're talking about political left or right or whatever, we're talking about a two-dimensional thing that's trying to represent life. So we always have to take it with a grain of salt. But I'm talking about people that may be oblivious or don't have any real respect for everyone's human rights. They need to be made uncomfortable. And if you are into what I do and you get that message and you're uncomfortable, good.
Yeah. Well, and the idea of movement comes from disrupting balance. It's like the only way you can walk is if you break your balance. The only way you can run is if you break your balance. And I think art can do that to people, is they can shake them in ways that maybe they can, like you said, there's this groove that it might bring them in, but then now you can shake them a little bit and maybe some movement can happen for people. And I think there's a lot of, that's why I love the power of music, power of art, the power, like even the visual arts, like how it can challenge people, but in a way that sometimes the typical person, maybe in a political debate, at a pub one night, they would get really angry and storm out, but instead they can listen to this song and maybe like, I wonder what the story is behind it. And I think that's the power. The power comes with the song, and then as well as you coming in and telling the story behind it. Because again, like me, like I said, I just thought racism was over, and then you start to see like this other world that exists simply. And I'm ignorant to it. I was ignorant to it simply because I didn't live that life. So
right. And the Omaha Police Department has surveilled some of my friends. It just actually came out that they were surveilling a friend of mine, and there's been articles written about it, so I can say it. Morgan Freeman was surveilled heavily by the Omaha Police Department.
Wow.
And if by releasing Fuck the OPD, they decide to keep tabs on me, or they decide to try to fuck my shit up, well, then that's one less Black person or person of color that that they're going to be able to fuck with. So it really, I mean, I don't know, man. We spent a lot of time talking about it, but I think it's important.
No, it's great
Um,
that you're getting that story out there, man. And
yeah, and
I
it,
think
it, it it needs to be told, and it's not more or less important than anything else that's going on nationally or globally. It's just our little slice of it,
yeah.
there are people here, and it's not insignificant that Omaha has been a blue dot now twice. Nebraska is one of two states, Nebraska and Maine, ironically, that can split the vote. And I actually voted in the last three presidential elections I voted in. I was in a state that split. So in 2008, we Omaha broke for Obama. Um, I was very disillusioned in 2012. I'll be totally honest. I did not vote in 2012. I was also a resident of New York at the time, so I didn't feel like it really mattered. I was wrong, but I was pretty disillusioned about things. In 2016, I went up to my folks' place and I voted there. And unfortunately, their rural district broke for Trump, which was awful. But then in 2020, Omaha broke for Biden. So the last three times I voted in a presidential election, it's been split, which is very strange. But Omaha
You chose right.
Omaha, yeah. Well, yeah. I voted correctly
you
all
placed
of
yourself
those times.
in the right spots.
Yeah.
Now I'm curious for you.
Mhm.
This idea of social change, has it always been something that's been part of your life, or is it something that you grew into through all the different experiences and the touring and all that?
Well, I think we're only a culmination of our experiences. So I mean, literally, who we are is a story that we tell ourselves. And I had a great friend who was an old hippie. He was actually in San Francisco at Haight-Ashbury in '69, and he's no longer with us. He passed in 2013, but he was one of my great friends. His name was Michael Pryor, but he went by Mojo Poe, and he used to say, "What's the first question you ask yourself every morning?" And the answer to that question is, who am I? I mean, really, who am I? You don't remember asking yourself that, but on some level you do. Every time you wake up, you have to ask yourself, who am I? And then you remember and you become, conscious in the awake world again. And we get to tell ourselves, what we remember from yesterday and those experiences that shaped us and the trauma that we've all experienced and all of those things. So yeah, we are literally a culmination, a story of the experiences that we've had throughout our life. And yeah, like I mentioned before, I look back on myself in former years and decades and say, yeah, of course I was naive about these things. Of course. Now, was I ever a Republican, for lack of a better way to shape that? Was I ever
It's become
was
such
I
a
ever
dividing
that way?
line now.
Yeah, I know. No, I was raised by people who called themselves Democrats, and there are pitfalls in the Democrats as well. Like, it's not all roses. It's not. I'm not going to pretend.
Really,
like
it's
that's
not.
yeah, exactly.
After seeing the last primaries, oh my god, that's
there
a whole
are
other podcast.
so many problems, and I actually don't consider myself a Democrat anymore, because again, it's a two-dimensional thing. But that's the best way I can kind of shape this point right now. Yeah, I always felt like I had empathy for people and human rights. Now, did I understand anything really? Like, no. But I'm also a history buff, and I feel like knowing history is also really important. Knowing, for instance, where police departments came from initially, that's an important thing. Knowing how they started in the South, in the North. I listened to a podcast called Behind the Bastards with
I'm not familiar with
a
it.
journalist
Check it out.
named Robert Evans, who is incredibly informative and a kind of a walking bibliography. And he did a 6-part podcast called Behind the Police. And he talked about, where do we get police departments? And this is probably common knowledge to a lot of people, but a lot of police departments in the South that were started before emancipation, they were started as slave catching units. If you look at, I don't know how Kansas City started, but I do know how St. Louis started. St. Louis started as a slave catching unit and as an Indian catching unit or Indian fighting unit, right? And the use of dogs in Ferguson to this day comes out of that culture. And it doesn't mean that all police there want slavery or are racist. It just means that culture has been handed down for generations. And if you think about it, when were your grandparents born?
God,
my grandparents were born in the 20s.
I'm not sure offhand.
I'm
guessing mine would be the 20s.
Yeah, I was born in 1985. I'm 35 years old. My grandparents were born almost 100 years ago, right? Mm-hmm. So that's 3 generations. We're talking maybe 5 or 6 generations ago. It's not really that long if you think about it in terms of, how long people live and generationally and the timeline that people are brought into this world. So,
well, in that history, it provides the systemic impact, and that's what a lot of people, I feel like, still struggle to see. Like you said, there's maybe not every cop in Ferguson is walking around saying I want slavery back or even racist, but there's a systemic problem that just has seeped into every single piece of what policing has been, and blow it all the way up to even how we work in America. Like you mentioned Kansas City, we have, I don't know the history of the policing here in Kansas City, but I do know we have a hugely problematic history when it comes to housing and racism, and there's a dividing highway that separates, even to this day, races and demographic, from a poverty to people who are affluent, and it's still there to this day that people are trying to pick it apart. And that systemic piece, whether it's one-to-one from people actually doing it now, that systemic piece still exists and still needs to be dismantled.
I mean, you're totally right. You think about the idea of generational wealth, and I think about my grandparents, and I think about the scores of people that were my ancestors that were murdered in the Holocaust, and how horrible that was, and how lucky my grandmother was to be able to come here, because they almost left her with a somewhat well-to-do uncle and aunt, and it was 35. Nobody knew how bad it was going to get, But at the last minute, her mom couldn't leave her, and they found a way to get her here. Okay, and that was just because of a British passport. Other boats that were coming that were had Eastern European Jews on them, they were turned around in New York Harbor. We don't talk about that much. We don't talk about the fact that in 1939, the Nazi Bund Party had 20 or 30,000 people at Madison Square Garden, and American flags with swastikas on them were normal.
I didn't even know that.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
We just like to tell the savior stories. We went in and defeated them later. Same when we think about the Native Americans and what we did.
Fascism was in vogue before the horrors of the Holocaust was exposed. And I say that to say this, because a generation later, in 1952, my grandparents were afforded the opportunity to have a mortgage in a place that was called Sheffield Lake, which was near Cleveland in Ohio. And it didn't matter that they were the only Jewish family in town. It didn't matter that my grandmother had actually, when she was 12 years old, looked out the window when her and her family were all old world Jews. And she looks out the window and she says, look at all these people walking around in Brooklyn. God's not striking them down. So she quietly and humbly renounced her religion, didn't raise her family with it, never told her parents because it would have broken their hearts. But they weren't religious. Still, it didn't stop kids in the neighborhood from saying to my grandfather, why'd you kill Jesus? And kids so young, they couldn't have possibly known what that meant.
Exactly. It's something that just was handed down to them.
I say this to say, because even out of all of that, they were still afforded that mortgage. And what happened, my grandmother died when I was very young. My grandfather was around until 2002. And he used that equity to help my mom, who was a single mom at that point. They bought a house together in an area called Cleveland Heights, where I grew up for 12 years, with my grandfather on the second floor and my mom and I on the first floor. It was a duplex, but like a level duplex. So it wasn't like townhouse side by side. So when I think about that history, and it's really the history of redlining, when I think about that history, I was afforded a happy and consistent, and we weren't rich. We lived hand to mouth. I mean, my mom didn't make a ton of money, but it was a stable childhood in one house until we moved to Bellevue, Nebraska, which is near Omaha. And that happy childhood, that stable childhood, was literally built from the equity that was afforded to my grandparents in 1952 with that mortgage that was not afforded to people of color, to people in the Black community. And they were given loans that were like a lot of times rent to own, where if you missed one payment or you were even late on a payment, they could just kick you out of it and you would have nothing, no equity to show for it. And that was a decision that the banks made in the 30s, when a lot of these, subdivisions started happening, and white flight was maybe a little bit away, but it was starting, the seeds were being planted for that. And I think a lot about that. And I think a lot about generational wealth. And I think about the families that still have, massive amounts of money, that a lot of which was made on the backs of the American system of slavery. You can't, if we're just a culmination of our experiences, you cannot, say that, everybody has a fair shake in America. The idea of the American dream is absolutely ridiculous. It's not that you can't make a lot of money if you have a great idea, but that's the exception. That's not the rule. The rule is not, equity. It's one thing to say we're all equal and it's equality and all of this stuff, and all of this all of these liberal ideas that don't take into account, the history and what has happened. Yeah. Reality. Yeah. But equity, where is that equity that was afforded to even regular, lower middle class kid growing up in the 80s and 90s? So many people don't even have, don't come into the world with that amount of equity. And, I'm obviously grateful for the decisions my grandparents made, and it's not their fault. It's an indictment of white supremacy. And at the same time, they were the right color to get that loan. And that sticks with me. I think about that a lot. And that's why I think history is really important, and not just the history of our country or atrocity is obviously important, to study that kind of stuff. And, before Watchmen came out, not many people knew about what happened in Tulsa in 1921.
Actually, the beginning of this whole podcast for me, my third interview was a guy named Eric Ryan Johnson. He's a musician out in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I was on tour. It was hilarious. I was on tour just getting coffee, and we struck up a conversation, found out he's this musician. We end up doing a thing in the Jazz Museum, record it, and there was a first time, and this was like 2 years ago. I'm 40.
Wow.
And it was the first time I was ever introduced to the Tulsa riots and to understand what it was, because he understood that history, and he's like, it's literally right over the river is where it happened. And it blew my mind. Like you said, then the Watchmen kind of bring it out to the culture as a whole. And it's like, those are the things that people need to contend with and accept. Yeah. And it seeps down all the way down to, this is like from women's issues, like down to the point where I had an interview just like 2 days ago with a woman who's fighting for women in the literary world. And that the concept of women are simply not even invited to the table just because it was kind of a men's club. And so, and then you see the same thing happening in race as well, where they didn't have those relationships with the bankers. They didn't have those relationships with the people who made the decision in codes and to do building or investments. And so they have to break through so many things, so many barriers that all too often other people don't. And it's a reality today that people have to look at. Yeah, absolutely.
One thing that really sticks with me is like we it's like that equality versus equity thing. We see a lot of commercials now with a lot of different people and a lot of different backgrounds. But I'll tell you what I've never really seen on a commercial: a small fucking house. Can you think of the last time you saw like a really tiny house that like somebody who is maybe making it but like just barely getting by, or even maybe has more room, we don't know, but just lives in a house that isn't like super
So you're talking
ultra
like simply being able to
nice.
take just that next step, as
I'm
opposed
talking
to
about
the big
I'm talking
dream
about we
home with all the.
pretend yeah, we pretend that everybody lives in these big houses and it's like and if we just put, different colored people in those houses, that we get somehow everything is cool. It's like,
Right.
well, there's this whole facet of society that we're just not talking about,
Hmm.
and I don't know, man. I feel like
Well,
if I go on too much about it, I'm going to start talking in circles. At some
that's all
point,
right.
I'd like to talk about what's coming next because I have a lot of things on my plate.
Definitely. And I'm realizing time wise too, I got to wrap actually pretty
You're
soon, but
good.
this is
Yeah.
and I have certain guests who over time are no doubt are going to come back on. But I think this is such a powerful conversation for people to hear and to understand. And I love what you're doing. I think that was I don't even I think maybe it was Eddie who connected me to you or something,
Yeah.
and I
Yeah, it
saw
was.
that
Yeah.
song and I was like, oh my God, we got to get you on here. To what I'm going to do, I have two more questions for you.
Yeah.
These could probably be a little more snippets, and then we'll
Sure.
end with like what you got coming up next and where
Sounds
people can
good.
find what you're doing. But the two questions, the big ones for the podcast, is the idea of living a great life, creating great things. And so I'm curious to you, if you had to define it right now in your life, how would you define living a great life?
Well, existence. I'd like to be able to exist. I'd like to be able to raise this family that is almost here, and it's all about love. There's two religions, right? Love and fear. So
Hmm.
I'd like to belong to the former as much as possible, and I don't love the idea of a system that requires us to make acquire a bunch of capital in order to do
Hmm.
that. I don't like the fact that, being self-employed, and my partner's also self-employed, that no bank will talk to us even if we have the money to buy a home. I think that my former neighbor, Warren Buffett, and I throw him under the bus because he's a great example, because everybody talks about, oh, he's a normal guy. He lives in a regular house. Yeah, he does live in a regular house, but he's also got the money to end homelessness in America. He could literally
Right.
feed, clothe, and house everybody in America that needed it today and still be one of the richest men on the planet. I don't like living in a society that rewards people for just acquiring capital. I think there's a better way to do things, and I don't think it's completely devoid of capitalism. I think that money is a better thing to trade than, like, say I've got 3 cows and you've got this other thing that I need, and we have to figure out that some.
Yeah,
I
you got to
think that
carry that
it's
shit all around with you.
yeah, it's a without taking it to this extreme that our society has taken it, it's a great thing. But I think that we need an economy that's based on our resources, on something real. That being said, I, I would like to exist. I would like to keep doing the thing that I know I was put on this planet to do, and I would like to love on my family and raise them, and live in a world where maybe we don't have a pandemic. That'd be nice.
That would be
But
awesome.
yeah,
I love that there's two religions, love and fear, and living out of that. And I think with your just in this conversation, your thoughtfulness and your introspection, no doubt, is going to drive you down that right road, definitely. And preparing to be a dad, I mean, that's huge, man. I have
well,
four
I hope
boys,
so.
so it's
Oh, great,
that
man.
journey is it's a cool journey, man. It's crazy as fuck too sometimes, but it's
Yeah,
a cool journey. So
yeah, and I think piggybacking off that introspectiveness comment, being able to admit when I'm wrong. You know, that's such a huge thing, I think, for people to be able to do. You know, if we can just admit when we fuck up, I think we'll be a lot better people. So I'll leave it at that.
Huge. And honestly, as a parent, my oldest is going to be 17 in like a week. Our youngest is 7. So we've been on, long journey with this. And honestly, that's a big piece. I think Bertrand Russell has like these maxims that he puts out that I was reading through. He can be problematic on some levels too, but there's some good stuff in there. But
Sure.
it's, there was something about like, I can't remember word for word, but talked about how hypocrisy cannot exist in good parenting. And it's like, and I took it to kind of talk about that. It's like, when you fuck up, be honest about it. And when there's things like, a lot of times we want to hide the things from our kids, and instead it's like, this is what it is, and this is what's happening. And so, yeah, it's the last question.
Go ahead.
Yeah. One more
I was going to
thing
say,
on
I think everybody's problematic if you look hard enough.
That is great.
if we're looking for like a perfect savior Jesus complex, we're not going to find it. We're going to find reasons why everything is problematic. But yeah, it's moving towards the goal. It's the journey. It's not the end result.
Well, and that you bring up a good point too, of just the climate that even politically that has been in the last 4 years or really longer, but it's like almost everyone's
40,
looking for
60,
that perfection.
80.
Yeah. That perfection or the savior complex. And to the point where like I love that you just push back on that, because I catch myself saying all the time where it's like, I don't agree with everything this person says. It's like, well, do we? Anyway, it's a great question. Do you agree with everything that everyone says? Like,
do you live in somebody else's head? Shit, do you agree with everything you say? I sure don't.
Right. Like, yeah, I probably said some shit in the last podcast where I'm looking back like, nah, I don't know. But yeah, if someone, there's lines, if someone's a racist asshole, like that's a whole different thing. But then there's a myriad of things that everyone can disagree on. But I'm digressing. The last question.
I'm going to piggyback off that because I feel like this is important. As much as we want to, do away with racism, I think part of that is making room for people to admit that they were wrong. I don't know that it happens very often, but we have these generational divides, and we have, so there has to be room for people to say, you know what, I said some fucked up shit, I believed some fucked up shit, and I'm learning. And if somebody is headed in the right direction, doesn't mean you have to be their friend. But I think we also have to be careful as a society to, I think we're seeing a lot of what happens, and it's not necessarily the people's fault that cast them out. I think there's a lot of fucked up shit, but I think when somebody is sort of cast out of society because of their beliefs or deplatformed because of it. And again, I agree with deplatforming certain beliefs. I'm not saying anything else. It's a very convoluted statement. Right. But if there's no reconciliation there with somebody that's actually trying, or if you're just excommunicated forever, well, you see what happens, right? You get January 6th. You get people believing in wacky conspiracy theories. You get Alex Joneses. You get, Rush Limbaugh's. And people believing all that shit. And I think there has to be room for the exception, which is that, you know what, I believe some fucked up shit, and I'm working on it, and that's I'm trying really hard.
You're speaking to, honestly, a thing that I'm processing. I literally, before this podcast, I was processing with my wife. We went and got coffee sitting in the car, because I used to be the person who thought gays were going to hell. I used to be the person who thought white privilege didn't exist. I used to be the person who kept voting for Bush, even though all these, all these different things. And it's like, now I look back on that person I was, and if I met that person, it'd be hard to even hang out with me. And that's what I was saying, is like, I'm trying to make peace with even my own past, because it's like somewhere along the way, I started seeing that these things weren't true. These things weren't real. And it's like, there were people who were in my life who helped me see that and helped walk alongside and gave me grace during that time to become who I am now, and no doubt grow in my ideals in the future too. So yeah, I guess I say all that to say I'm processing, like, how can I be that maybe for somebody else who I would almost cringe now at having those same ideas I had back then. Like, how do you help them come through that?
I think it's really important for you, having that history, to try to pinpoint what it was that got you thinking differently, that got you thinking with more of an open mind. And it's not that we can, I'm not going to change the world by releasing Fuck the OPD. You're not going to change the world by, helping somebody who's in a similar situation, whose mind might be opening, but maybe isn't ready for, who's in that journey,
Right.
But you can affect the people in your life. And I think that's the most important thing, for regular Joes like ourselves,
That's
so
good,
I
man.
think that's really important.
I love it. And so, last question: how would you define creating great things right now in your life?
Well, we all, going along with that antenna of creation, we all have a unique DNA in whatever we decide to do, whether it's insurance sales or, writing music or creating art or teaching. We have to lean into that. It comes along with practicing our strengths. Everybody wants to talk about, especially a lot of times musicians who are on the path to greatness are trying to walk that path. They're like, okay, what am I deficient on? That's great. It's a great question to ask yourself. What are you strong at? What makes you you? Can you practice those things? Can you get deeper in that? So that's what I really want to focus on, is I want to keep, creating depth at, the things that I do, and I want to get better at the things that I'm already, that already make me, and I want to lean into who I really am. And I don't want to sound like anybody else. I might, but I'm not trying to sound like anybody else. When people ask me who my true influences are, it's a really hard question to answer. I mean, I have my elevator pitch. I'm somewhere between Jim James, Bill Withers, and Pink Floyd, but that's not real. That's not real
Right.
at all. Like, it is real. It's a surface level thing, though. I am me, and I'm just trying to be the best version of myself that I can every day in every facet of life. And kind of coming back to it, if I do some fucked up shit or say some fucked up shit, I want to own that, and I want to grow from that.
That's awesome, man. Well, let everyone know kind of what's next for you, and then how they can find what you've already done.
Oh, I'll plug my pluggables. So I stole that from
I
Robert
like that.
Evans of Behind the Bastards. That's what he says
I'm
at the
gonna
end
have
of
to
every
steal it from
episode.
you then.
So you can find me at andrewbaileymusic.com. Now you got to watch the spelling of Bailie. My last name is spelled Bailie. So there's three spellings of Bailie. There's the one that's like Bailey's Irish Cream, Bailey. There's the Scottish, which is Baillie. And then there's like the Northern Irish, which is Balie. Full disclosure, that wasn't my last name at birth. My stepdad, who is my real dad, and I'm sure there's a lot of people can relate to that, adopted me, and his name was Bailie. So I'm an Eastern European Ashkenazi Jew with an Irish last name. Go figure. I'm a mutt like everybody else,
I
right?
love it.
So it's
That's America, baby.
it's andrewbaileymusic.com, and from there you can find all of my socials. I'm kind of an old guy, so I'm on Facebook, Instagram. I have a Twitter that doesn't get used very much. I'm not on TikTok. I am on Clubhouse, but I'm not on Clubhouse. If you know what I mean. You can
I
find
feel you.
you can find my YouTube channel from there. And you can also look up my link tree where all of these are. Actually, if you go to my Instagram at Andrew Bailey Music, you can find the link tree there, and you can check out everything that I'm doing. You can go to YouTube, subscribe to my channel. You'd be one of the first few dozen to do that, and you can watch Fuck the OPD and some other. I have some teaching tutorials up there. We're putting a masterclass together, hopefully before this baby arrives. So look for that if you're interested. We're going to be talking about songwriting. We're going to be talking about releasing music, and what it takes to try to to get into those worlds. And I have a lot of music that's coming up. We're shooting a video for the next single, which is called No Shame. We don't have a release date on that. but it will be out sometime soon. We're shooting that on Tuesday, and I'm just very excited to keep producing videos, which is a relatively new thing for me, and have a video with every single that releases is kind of the goal. And I no longer have dreams of grandeur, of fame and fortune. I just do this because I don't think there's any other thing that I was put here to do other than the things that I'm doing. So I'll keep plugging along with that. And, whoever wants to come along for the ride is more than welcome.
Boom. I love it. Well, thanks for making the time, man. It was awesome. Great insights.
Thank you so much for having me. Looking forward to meeting you in real life post-pandemic.
Yes.
And can't wait to get back down to Kansas City and play some with my friends, including Eddie Moore, We the People, Zach Morrow, and all of those guys. So very excited.
And congrats
for
on
that.
the baby coming up, man.
Thank you so much.
That's cool. That'll be a fun.
Yeah, we're so excited. So we can't wait to meet our little girl. But anyway, really appreciate you having me on, and I'm looking forward to listening to and diving in and kind of binging all the episodes. So
it'll be cool, man. It'll be cool. Thanks again. And thank you for listening to the Live and Create podcast. If you like what you heard, make sure you subscribe and leave a comment or a review.
The Live and Create podcast.